Harlem never truly slept, but there were nights when it seemed to hold its breath, as though the streets themselves understood that something larger than ordinary life was unfolding. This was one of those nights. The kind where the glow of street lamps felt softer, where conversations lingered a second longer, where even the wind weaving between brownstone buildings carried a quiet anticipation. It had been nearly a week since whispers began circling through the neighborhood, whispers about tension, about power shifting in ways no one could quite explain, about certain men testing boundaries that should have remained untouched. And beneath it all, one name moved through conversations not loudly, but with a kind of steady gravity. Bumpy Johnson. No one spoke his name carelessly. Not because of fear, but because of understanding. In a place where survival often depended on reading the room before the room spoke, Bumpy Johnson had become something rare, a man whose presence alone seemed to draw a line between chaos and order. He did not seek attention. He did not raise his voice. And yet, when things threatened to tip too far into disrespect or cruelty, he had a way of restoring balance that left people thinking long after he was gone. That balance had been disturbed, inside. One of Harlem's most revered clubs, a place where polished wood floors reflected the soft glow of chandeliers, and where music had, for years, offered both escape and identity. The atmosphere carried a tension that no melody could yet dissolve. The club was known not just for its performances, but for what it represented. It was a sanctuary, a space where talent spoke louder than prejudice, where artistry carved out dignity in a world that too often tried to deny it. And tonight, seated at the piano, preparing to bring that dignity to life, was a man whose name had long transcended the walls of Harlem. Duke Ellington. Ellington did not need to announce himself. His presence carried its own introduction. There was something almost regal in the way he sat, his posture composed, his expression thoughtful, as though he were not merely preparing to play music, but to tell a story that words could never fully contain. Those who had seen him perform before understood this well. His music did not simply fill a room. It transformed it. It reminded people of who they were, of what they deserved, of a dignity that could not be taken, only forgotten. Even before the first note, something felt unsettled. At the back of the room, conversations were quieter than usual. Not absent, but restrained. Eyes shifted more frequently toward the entrance, toward certain tables, toward men who carried themselves with a kind of deliberate confidence that did not belong to the music. These were not patrons who came to listen. They came to be seen, to assert, to remind others of hierarchies that had no place in a room built on art, but existed nonetheless. And among them, though not yet arrived, was a name that traveled faster than footsteps. Schultz. It was not his first time in Harlem, but each visit carried a different kind of weight. Schultz was not a man known for subtlety of intention, even if his actions often appeared measured on the surface. He understood power in its most visible form: control, dominance, the ability to bend environments to his will. And while Harlem had its own structure, its own unspoken rules, Schultz represented something outside of that. Something that did not always respect boundaries, it did not create. The club manager, a man who had spent years ensuring that every performance, every evening, upheld the reputation of the establishment, moved through the room with a practiced calm that masked the tension beneath. He greeted guests, adjusted details, offered polite smiles, but his eyes betrayed him. They lingered too long in certain directions, as though anticipating a disruption he could not prevent. Near the stage, Ellington's band prepared quietly, instruments tuned with care, movements deliberate and respectful. There was no outward sign of concern among them, but musicians have always understood something deeper than words: the emotional temperature of a room. And tonight it was unmistakable. Ellington himself remained composed. If he sensed the tension, he did not allow it to alter his presence. His hands rested lightly on the keys, not yet pressing, not yet beginning, but ready. always ready. There was a discipline in that stillness, a refusal to let external forces dictate internal rhythm. Outside, a car door closed. It was a small sound, barely noticeable in the grand scheme of the city, but inside the club, it rippled. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A glass stopped just short of a sip. The manager's shoulders tightened, ever so slightly. The entrance door opened, and with it came a shift, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable. Dutch Schultz entered the room. He did not rush. Men like Schultz never did. He walked with the kind of confidence that assumed space would be made for him, and as he moved, it was. Not dramatically, not with overt gestures, but in the subtle ways people adjust when they recognize a presence that carries consequences. Chairs shifted slightly. Conversations redirected. Eyes lowered, then lifted again cautiously. Schultz acknowledged no one directly. Not because he didn't see them, but because he didn't need to. His attention was selective, deliberate. He scanned the room not as a guest, but as someone assessing territory. And when his gaze finally settled near the stage, it lingered not on the musicians collectively, but on Ellington himself. There was no expression of admiration, no curiosity, only a kind of detached observation, as though evaluating something rather than appreciating it. He took his seat. The manager approached, offering a greeting that balanced politeness with restraint. Schultz responded briefly, his tone neutral, but edged with something unspoken. It wasn't hostility, not yet, but it wasn't respect either. It was something colder. Indifference shaped by power. On stage, Ellington gave a slight nod to his band. The first note was about to be played. And in that moment, just before sound met silence, there existed a fragile line. A line between what the night could be and what it might become. The music began. Soft at first, measured, intentional. A melody that did not demand attention but invited it. It moved through the room like a quiet conversation, touching each table, each listener, reminding them gently of something deeper than the tension that had settled there. For a moment, it worked. The room softened. Shoulders relaxed. Conversations ceased not out of caution, but out of respect. This was what the club had always been, a place where music restored what the world tried to erode. But not everyone listened the same way. At his table, Schultz leaned back, one arm draped casually. His posture relaxed, but his attention sharp. He listened not to the beauty of the music, but to the reaction it commanded, to the way the room responded, to the influence it held. And influence to a man like him was never neutral. A faint smile touched his lips, not of enjoyment, but of consideration. He said something to the man beside him. A quiet remark. It drew a small chuckle. Nothing loud enough to disrupt, but enough to exist outside the rhythm of the room. On stage, Ellington continued. If he heard it, he did not show it. But something had shifted. Near the entrance, unnoticed by most, another figure appeared. He did not command attention by entering. He did not alter the room through presence alone, at least not immediately. He simply stepped inside, paused briefly as his eyes adjusted to the light, and took in the scene before him with a calm, measured gaze. It was Bumpy Johnson. He did not move toward the stage. He did not approach Schultz. He simply observed, and in that observation, there was understanding, not of what had already happened, but of what was about to. Bumpy walked slowly along the edge of the room, his steps unhurried, his posture relaxed yet purposeful. Those who recognized him did not react outwardly, but something subtle changed in their demeanor. A quiet steadiness returned. Not because they expected action, but because they knew, if action became necessary, it would be measured. He took a seat, not prominently, not hidden, just enough to see clearly. His gaze moved once more across the room, to Ellington, to Schultz, to the space between them. The music continued, but beneath it, something else had begun to build. Not noise, not conflict, but tension, the kind that does not announce itself, but grows quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment it can no longer remain contained. And though no one could yet say how the night would unfold, there was a shared, unspoken awareness among those who felt it. This was not just another performance. This was the beginning of something that would test more than music, that it would test dignity, that it would test restraint. And before the night was over, it would reveal clearly and undeniably what kind of power truly mattered. The music did not stop, but something inside it changed. At first, no one could quite name it. The melody still flowed with the same precision, the same elegance that had made Duke Ellington a figure of quiet reverence across rooms far beyond Harlem. The notes still rose and fell with intention, still carried the richness of a man who understood how to turn struggle into beauty. And yet, beneath that surface, there was now a tension woven into the sound itself, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable to those who listened with more than their ears. It was as if the music had become aware of the room, aware of the imbalance settling in like a shadow that refused to leave. At the center of that shadow sat Dutch Schultz. He had not raised his voice. He had not disrupted the performance in any obvious way. That was not his method, not tonight. Instead, he leaned into something far more corrosive, control through indifference. He spoke when others listened. He laughed when silence was expected. He treated the music not as something to be respected, but as something incidental, something that existed only because he allowed it to. And in doing so, he began to reshape the atmosphere of the room without ever needing to command it directly. At first, it was small things. A remark spoken just loud enough to reach nearby tables, cutting across the rhythm of a piano passage that deserved stillness. A dismissive gesture when one of Ellington's musicians took a brief, brilliant solo, fingers dancing across keys or brass lifting into something that should have drawn admiration, only to be met with a casual wave as though swatting away a passing inconvenience. The kind of behavior that, in another setting, might have been ignored. But here, in this room, it landed differently, because this room understood what the music meant. And so, each moment of disregard carried weight. Across the club, reactions varied, not outwardly, not in ways that would invite escalation, but internally. Some patrons stiffened in their seats, their appreciation now tinged with discomfort. Others avoided looking toward Schultz's table entirely, choosing instead to focus on the stage with an almost deliberate intensity, as if refusing to acknowledge what threatened to diminish it. A few exchanged glances, quick, silent, filled with questions no one dared to voice. Near the edge of the room, seated with the same composed stillness he had carried in with him, Bumpy Johnson watched. He did not react. Not yet. His gaze moved. Slowly, deliberately, taking in every detail, not just what Schultz was doing, but how the room responded to it. He noticed the tightening shoulders, the hesitant applause, the way conversations had shifted from ease to caution. He noticed Ellington, too, not just the man at the piano, but the discipline behind the performance, the quiet resolve required to continue as though nothing had changed. And Bumpy understood something that few others in that room fully grasped. This was not about noise. This was about erosion. On stage, Ellington's hands moved with the same grace they always had, but there was now a subtle difference in the way he held himself. Not weakness, never that, but awareness. A recognition that the room was no longer entirely his. That something had entered it that did not respect what he offered, and that the burden of maintaining dignity had just become heavier. Still, he did not falter. The music deepened. It shifted into something slower, more deliberate, each note placed with care, as though building something stronger beneath the surface. It was not a response, not directly, but it carried intention. A quiet assertion that artistry would not be reduced, that even in the presence of disregard, it would remain whole. For a moment, It seemed to reclaim the room. Conversation stilled again. Attention returned to the stage. The melody wrapped itself around the tension, softening its edges, reminding everyone present of what mattered. But Schultz was not a man who allowed control to slip so easily. He leaned forward now, his posture changing just enough to signal a shift in intention. The faint amusement that had rested on his expression earlier sharpened into something more deliberate. He spoke again, this time louder, not enough to be called an interruption, but enough that it could not be ignored. A few nearby patrons glanced at him, then quickly away. He gestured toward the stage, not angrily, not even dismissively in an obvious way, but with a kind of casual authority that carried a deeper message. It was the gesture of someone who believed that everything within his view existed within his influence. And that was when the discomfort in the room deepened into something else, because this was no longer subtle. It was no longer background noise. It was a statement. The band continued, but the energy had shifted. Musicians who had played with effortless flow now carried an added layer of focus, not because they were uncertain, but because they understood the weight of the moment. They were not just performing anymore. They were holding something together. Ellington's expression remained composed, but those closest to the stage could see it now, the slight tightening around his eyes, the controlled breath between phrases. He was not reacting outwardly, but he was absorbing it. The disrespect, the imbalance, the quiet attempt to diminish something that had taken a lifetime to build, and still, he played on. At his table, Schultz smiled faintly, not with joy, but with recognition. He could feel it, the shift, the way the room bent even slightly around his presence. It was not complete control, but it was enough. Enough to continue, enough to push further. Near the wall, Bumpy Johnson's gaze settled more firmly now. There was no anger in it, no immediate decision, but there was clarity. He had seen this before, not this exact moment, not this exact room, but this pattern, the slow testing of limits, the incremental steps that, if left unchecked, turned disrespect into something heavier, something that did not just affect a single man but everyone connected to him. Bumpy did not believe in reacting too soon, but he also did not believe in waiting too long. The line between the two was thin, and it was approaching. A server passed near Schultz's table, moving carefully, aware of the tension, but focused on her task. As she set down a drink, Schultz spoke again, this time not to the room, not to his companions, but to her. His tone was light, almost conversational, but the words carried an edge that made her pause for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. The kind of tone that reduced rather than acknowledged, that assumed rather than respected. She nodded quickly and moved away, but the moment lingered. Because now it wasn't just about the music. It was about everything. The room felt it. That quiet shift from discomfort to something heavier. Something closer to injustice, not loud, not explosive, but present. The kind that builds slowly, layer by layer, until it demands to be addressed. On stage, the music reached a pause, not an ending, but a natural break between movements. For a brief moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that should have been filled with appreciation. Instead, it was filled with anticipation. Schultz spoke again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The words were directed toward the stage, not shouted, not crude, but unmistakably dismissive. A remark that reduced what had just been played into something trivial, something replaceable, something unworthy of the attention it had commanded. It landed, harder than anything before, because it came at the exact moment when respect should have been highest. Across the room, something tightened. A man at a nearby table set his glass down more firmly than intended. Another shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched. The manager, standing near the bar, took a step forward, then stopped himself, caught between responsibility and reality. And on stage, for the first time, Ellington paused. Not long. Not dramatically, but long enough. Long enough for the room to feel it. Long enough for the weight of the moment to settle fully. Then, with a composure that bordered on defiance, he placed his hands back on the keys and began again. But this time, the music was different. It was not softer. It was not louder. It was deeper. Each note carried something more, something that could not be dismissed, could not be reduced. It was not a response to Schultz. It was a reaffirmation of self. A quiet declaration that dignity did not depend on acknowledgement. And yet, even that could not fully erase what had been done. Because this respect, once spoken, does not disappear. It lingers, it settles, it demands balance. At the edge of the room, Bumpy Johnson leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unchanged, but his decision forming. He did not look toward Schultz immediately. Instead, his gaze returned to Ellington. To the man who continued to play. To the man who had chosen grace over reaction. And in that moment, Bumpy understood exactly what was required. Not anger, not force. Something else, something quieter. Something final. The music continued. The tension deepened. And though no one spoke it aloud, the room had reached a point where it could no longer remain as it was. Something was coming. Not loud, not chaotic, but certain. And when it arrived, it would not just change the night. It would define it. The music did not break, but the room nearly died by now. Every soul inside that Harlem club understood that the night had crossed an invisible threshold. What began as tension had matured into something heavier. Something that pressed against the walls, settled into the air, and refused to dissolve. It was no longer just discomfort. It was a quiet crisis of dignity, one that demanded resolution. Though no one dared to decide how that resolution should come. On stage, Duke Ellington continued to play, but the music had evolved into something almost spiritual. It was no longer performance alone, it was endurance. Each note carried weight. Each chord layered with restraint, as though he were holding together not just a melody, but the very integrity of the room. His posture remained composed, his expression calm, but beneath that calm lived a strength that could only come from a man who had faced such moments before and chosen, every time, not to surrender to them. Yet even the strongest resolve has a self, as a limit, not in breaking, but in what it is asked to carry. And tonight, that burden was being tested deliberately. At his table, Dutch Schultz had grown more comfortable, not louder, not reckless, but emboldened. The subtlety that had once masked his intentions was now thinning, replaced by a confidence that came from seeing how far he could go without consequence. He leaned into conversations that overlapped with the music, allowed laughter to rise just slightly above what was appropriate, and spoke with the kind of casual disregard that made his presence feel less like an intrusion and more like an assertion. He was no longer testing the room. He was shaping it. Around him, the effect was undeniable. Patrons who had once leaned forward in admiration now sat with a guarded stillness. The rhythm of the evening, once guided by Ellington's piano, now stumbled, interrupted by an undercurrent that refused to be ignored. The club manager moved. More frequently now, his steps measured but restless, his eyes searching for a solution that did not exist within his reach, because this was no longer about management. It was about power. And power, when misused, does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes, it arrives with quiet certainty, daring anyone to challenge it. Near the far side of the room, Bumpy Johnson remained seated, but the stillness that defined him had shifted. Not outwardly, no one would have noticed a dramatic change, but internally, something had aligned. The patience he carried, the discipline that governed his actions, had brought him to a point where observation was no longer enough. He had seen the pattern. He had allowed it space. Now, he understood its intent, and more importantly, its cost. His gaze moved once more across the room, slower now, more deliberate. He watched the patrons, the musicians, the staff. He watched Ellington, whose music had become both shield and statement. And finally, he looked at Schultz, not as an adversary, not as an enemy, but as a man who had chosen a path that required correction. Not punishment. Correction. Because Bumpy Johnson did not believe in escalation. He believed in balance. On stage, the music reached another turning point, not an ending, but a shift in tempo. Ellington's hands slowed, his touch lighter, as though guiding the room toward a quieter place. It was an invitation, one last opportunity for the night to return to what it had been meant to be. For a brief moment, it worked. The room softened. Again, conversations fell away. Even Schultz, for a second, seemed to pause, not out of respect, but out of curiosity. The melody carried something undeniable now, something that reached beyond preference or opinion. It spoke of something deeper, of resilience, of identity, of a quiet refusal to be diminished. And then Schultz leaned forward. The movement was small, but it carried intention. He placed his glass down with a deliberate lack of care, the sound sharper than it needed to be, cutting through the softness of the music. He said something, not loudly, but clearly enough that those closest to him could hear. And what he said was not just dismissive, it was personal, it was directed, it was the kind of remark that did not simply disregard the music but the man behind it. The room felt it instantly, not as noise but as impact. A few patrons turned, their expressions tightening. The musicians on stage exchanged brief glances, their focus momentarily fractured. The manager took another step forward, then stopped again, caught in the same invisible restraint. And Ellington, for the second time that evening, paused. This time, it was longer, not long enough to be called a halt, but long enough to be felt. His hands hovered above the keys, suspended between continuation and silence. His head lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in thought. In that brief moment, the entire room seemed to lean toward him, not physically but emotionally, waiting to see what he would do. Would he stop? Would he acknowledge it? Would he allow the moment to define the night? The silence stretched. And in that silence, something profound happened. Ellington did not look toward Schultz. He did not respond. He did not react. Instead, he closed his eyes just for a breath, and when he opened them again, there was something different in his gaze. Not anger, not hurt, but clarity. Then he played, and what followed was unlike anything that had come before. The music was no longer an invitation. It was a declaration. Each note carried conviction, each phrase deliberate, each transition purposeful. It rose not in volume, but in presence, filling the room in a way that left no space for anything else. It was not defiance in the loud sense. It was something stronger. It was unshakable dignity. And for a moment, just a moment, it overpowered everything. Even Schultz felt it. The faint confidence that had rested on his expression faltered, not visibly, not in a way that would admit defeat, but enough to register. He leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing, as though reassessing something he had previously dismissed. Because this was not weakness. This was not something that could be easily controlled. And yet he smiled, not with appreciation, but with decision, because men like Schultz did not step back when challenged. They stepped forward. He rose from his seat. The movement was smooth, unhurried, but it carried weight. Conversation ceased instantly. The music continued, but now it existed alongside something else entirely. Schultz adjusted his jacket, his posture relaxed but intentional, and began to move not toward the exit, not toward the bar, but toward the stage. Each step was measured, each step deliberate. The room watched. Some with unease, some with quiet disbelief. All with understanding. Because this was the moment. Near the wall, Bumpy Johnson stood, not abruptly. Not dramatically. but with a calm that felt almost inevitable. His chair moved back without sound. His posture remained relaxed, his expression unchanged, but there was no hesitation in his movement. He began to walk not quickly, not forcefully, but with purpose that required no announcement. Two paths now moved toward the same point, one driven by assertion, the other by resolution. Schultz reached the edge of the stage. He did not climb it. He did not need to. He stood just close enough to be seen, just close enough to be heard, his presence now impossible to ignore. The music continued, but it no longer existed in isolation. It shared the space with him. Ellington did not stop, but he knew the room held its breath. And then before Schultz could speak, before the moment could tip into something irreversible, Bumpy Johnson arrived. He did not position himself between them in a confrontational way. He did not block, did not challenge, did not raise his voice. He simply stepped into the space beside Schultz, close enough to be part of the moment, calm enough to redefine it. For a brief second, the two men stood there, one representing force, the other control. Schultz turned his head slightly, acknowledging Bumpy now for the first time, not as a background presence, but as a factor. There was no immediate reaction, just a pause, a recalibration. Bumpy met his gaze. No anger, no threat, only certainty, the kind that does not need to be explained. And in that silence, that single, suspended moment, everything balanced on what would come next. The music played on, but the room no longer heard it the same way. Because now, the story was no longer unfolding in sound, it was unfolding in choice, and one of these men was about to make it. There are moments in life when the world does not move forward with noise, but with stillness, moments when everything hangs, suspended between what has been and what could become, waiting not for force, but for decision. That moment had arrived. The music continued, but it no longer led the room. Every eye, every breath, every unspoken thought had gathered around a single point, where Dutch Schultz stood at the edge of the stage, and beside him, with a calm that felt almost immovable, stood Bumpy Johnson, and just beyond them, seated at the piano, was Duke Ellington, still playing, still choosing dignity, still holding the room together. But now, the burden had shifted, because this was no longer his moment to carry. This belonged to Bumpy. For a brief second, nothing happened. No one spoke. No one moved. Even Schultz, who had entered the moment with intent, found himself paused, not stopped, but held in place by something he could not immediately define. It wasn't fear. It wasn't resistance. It was something more unsettling. It was presence. Bumpy did not look at the crowd. He did not acknowledge the tension. He did not even look at Ellington. His attention remained on Schultz, not confrontational, not challenging, but steady. The kind of gaze that did not ask for control, but quietly assumed it. Then, without a single wasted motion, Bumpy reached into his coat. The room tightened. It was instinctive. Shoulders stiffened. Breaths caught. The fragile balance that had held until now threatened to fracture in an instant. But Bumpy's movement was slow. Deliberate. Measured in a way that left no room for panic. From his pocket, he withdrew something small. Simple. Unfolded. A straight razor. He did not open it fully. He did not brandish it. He did not raise it. Instead, he stepped slightly forward, just enough to reach the small table beside Schultz, and placed it down with quiet precision. The sound it made was barely audible, but in that room, it echoed. Not as a threat, but as a message. Bumpy's voice, when it came, was soft. So soft that those furthest away had to lean into the silence to hear it. But it carried not because of volume, but because of truth. He spoke not about power. Not about territory. Not about consequence. He spoke about respect. He said, calmly, that some things in this world were sharp, not because they were dangerous, but because they required care. That when handled properly, they served a purpose. They created something clean, something precise. But when handled without respect, they revealed the character of the one holding them. He did not raise his eyes. He did not pause for effect. Simply finished the thought and stepped back. That was all. No threat. No demand. No escalation. And in that clarity, everything shifted. Schultz looked at the razor. For the first time that night, his confidence did not disappear, but it changed. The easy control he had carried, the casual authority, the quiet assumption that the room would bend, none of it vanished. But it was no longer complete, because now he had been seen. Not challenged in the way he expected, not confronted with force, but understood. And there is something deeply unsettling about being understood by a man who does not need to prove anything. The room waited, not for action, but for decision. Schultz's gaze moved from the razor to Bumpy, then slowly to Ellington. The music was still playing, still steady, still unbroken. And in that moment, something became undeniable. This room, this music, this dignity did not belong to him. It never had. The silence stretched just long enough to matter. Then Schultz did something no one in that room had expected. He stepped back. Not dramatically, not as surrender, but as acknowledgement. A small movement. A quiet recalibration. He adjusted his coat, his expression controlled, but different, now not diminished, but aware. He gave a brief glance toward Bumpy, not gratitude, not apology, but recognition. Then he turned and walked away. No words, no announcement. Just departure. And as he moved through the room, something remarkable happened. The tension did not follow him. It stayed behind. Then slowly, it dissolved. The door closed. And for the first time that night, the room breathed. Not loudly, not all at once, but collectively, a release. On stage, Ellington's hands never stopped, but now the music changed again. It softened. Not in weakness, but in restoration. The notes carried warmth now. A quiet triumph. Not victory over a man, but victory over a moment that could have become something else entirely. A moment that had been redirected, reclaimed, redeemed. Somewhere in the room, a woman lowered her head, her eyes closing as a single tear slipped free, not from sadness, but from something deeper, relief, recognition, the kind of emotion that comes when something fragile is protected without being broken. A man near the bar exhaled slowly, his grip on his glass loosening for the first time in what felt like hours. The manager, who had spent the night walking a line he could not control, finally allowed his shoulders to drop, his expression softening into something close to gratitude. And through it all, the music continued. Because it always had. And now, it was free again. Bumpy Johnson did not linger. He did not wait for acknowledgement. He did not look for approval. He simply turned, as calmly as he had arrived, and began to walk toward the exit. As he passed through the room, people noticed, but no one stopped him. Not out of hesitation, but out of respect. The kind of respect that does not need to be spoken. Near the stage, as he moved past Ellington, allowed himself the smallest glance, not enough to interrupt the performance, not enough to shift the moment, but enough. Their eyes met, just for a second. No words, none were needed. Because what had been done did not require explanation. It required understanding, and that understanding was complete. Bumpy gave the slightest nod. Then he continued. The door opened, then closed, and he was gone. But what he left behind remained. The music swelled gently, filling every corner of the room, not as a performance, but as a presence. A reminder. A restoration of something that had been tested and proven unbreakable. Because in the end, there had been no fight, no violence, no chaos. Just a man who understood that the strongest force in any room is not power, but control. Not dominance, but dignity. And not noise, but silence used at the right moment. And long after the final note faded, after the tables emptied, after the lights dimmed and Harlem returned to its restless rhythm, that silence remained, not as absence, but as memory. The kind that stays with you. The kind that reminds you that respect, once restored properly, does not need to be demanded again.